All right, so picture this. You're like, totally in the zone, like nailing a trivia question. Your brain is just buzzing with activity. Right. But it's not just chaos in there. It's
Yeah, yeah.
like billions of these tiny cells all working together, like some perfectly orchestrated symphony of electrical signals.
Hmm.
That's what we're diving into today, the world of neurons and glia. And to help us break it all down, we're going to be looking at excerpts from
Yes.
neuroscience, exploring the brain.
It's a fascinating world in there, that's for sure. And I think for the longest time, we had no idea how intricate it all
Oh, I
was.
know. Our textbook actually talks about how back in the 19th century,
Hmm.
scientists just thought the brain was like this continuous blob. They knew it was important, obviously,
Of course.
but they didn't have the tools to actually see what was going on at the cellular level.
They used to describe it as a reticulum, like a net, or even a bowl of jello, which isn't exactly the image that comes to mind when you think about, the human mind.
No, not at all. It's incredible to think that something we consider so complex could be seen as so simple just because we lacked the tools to really look at it.
It really is. It wasn't until Camillo Golgi developed his silver stain that we got our first clear glimpse of individual neurons.
Golgi's stain. Now, that's a name that sends shivers down every neuroscience student's spine. I remember learning about it in school. It was like throwing glitter on a hidden world. Suddenly you could see these intricate structures that were always there, just invisible.
Exactly. It was a complete game changer. Golgi's stain would stain neurons completely, allowing scientists to finally see their delicate branches and make out their shapes for the first time. But here's the funny thing. Golgi himself, he thought these neurons were all physically connected, like literally part of one giant continuous network.
Wait, so the guy who invented the thing that let us see neurons got it wrong about neurons? That's kind of hilarious.
Science is full of surprises. It actually took another scientist, Santiago Ramon y Cajal, to really figure it out.
Cajal, another legend in the field.
He was a Spanish neuroscientist, and quite the artist, I might add. He used Golgi's stain, studied the stained neurons meticulously, and realized these things aren't connected at all. They're distinct units.
So wait, just by carefully observing what Golgi had made visible, Cajal made a completely different revolutionary discovery.
Precisely. His observations led to what we now call the neuron doctrine, the idea that neurons are the fundamental units of the nervous system. They communicate with each other, yes, but they are not physically connected. This was a monumental shift in how we understood the brain.
Wow, talk about a plot twist. And here I thought cell biology was going to be straightforward. So thanks to some seriously dedicated observation and some beautiful staining, we went from thinking the brain was a homogeneous blob to understanding that it's made up of these distinct cells, all communicating with each other in this incredibly complex way.
It really makes you wonder what other mysteries are hidden within these cells, just waiting to be uncovered, doesn't it?
It really does. And speaking of uncovering mysteries, we've talked about how we finally saw neurons. But what's actually inside these fascinating cells? What makes a neuron different from, say, a skin cell? Let's zoom in and take a closer look at the anatomy of a neuron.
So we're picturing these individual neurons now, all thanks to Golgi and Kajal and their groundbreaking work. Now let's zoom in on one of these neurons. Right there in the center, you've got the soma. Think of it like the neuron's control center.
And inside the soma, there's the nucleus, right? That's where the DNA is.
Exactly. The nucleus, that's where the DNA lives, the genetic blueprint that makes you,
Yeah.
you. But here's the catch. What makes a neuron different from, say, a liver cell? It's not about the DNA itself, but which parts of that DNA are actually turned on.
Oh, interesting. So it's not like every cell uses every bit of DNA.
Nope. Think of it like this. You've got this giant cookbook, right? But each cell only reads the recipes it actually needs.
Okay, that makes sense. So a skin cell is reading the how to be a skin cell chapter,
Right.
and a neuron is all about the how to transmit signals section.
Exactly. You got it. And those instructions, encoded in the DNA, they're used to build proteins, which are like the workhorses of the cell. This whole process is called protein synthesis. And let me tell you, it's happening on a massive scale in neurons. They need a constant supply of new proteins to function correctly.
That makes sense. I mean, building those connections, sending those signals, it's got to be a lot of work for such a tiny cell.
Oh, it absolutely is.
Yeah.
And all that work requires energy. That's where mitochondria come in. They're like the power plants of the cell, constantly converting nutrients into ATP.
Ah, yes, ATP, the cellular energy currency.
You got it.
Mitochondria. I remember learning about those in school, but I never really connected them to brain activity before.
It's all connected. Neurons are energy hogs, all that thinking, learning, remembering. That takes a ton of power. The mitochondria are working overtime to keep those neurons fueled up and firing.
So we've got the control center with its genetic blueprints, the protein factories churning out those essential molecules, and the power plants keeping everything running. What's next on our neuron tour?
Now we get to the real stars of the show, the axon and the dendrites. These are the structures that allow neurons to send and receive signals, forming those intricate communication networks we were talking about earlier.
Okay, let's start with the axon. It sounds familiar, but give me a refresher. What does it do again?
So picture this. The axon is like this long, slender fiber stretching out from the soma like a highway. It carries information to other neurons. And just like a highway needs infrastructure to function properly, so does the axon.
Infrastructure, like what? Are we talking rest stops and gas stations for these cellular highways?
Not quite.
Yeah.
Imagine a complex transportation system inside the axon, constantly moving essential supplies for the soma all the way to the end of the axon where it connects with other neurons. That's called axoplasmic transport.
So it's like a bustling highway with tiny cargo trucks zipping back and forth, making sure everything gets where it needs to go.
A perfect analogy. And just like highways often have insulation to speed up traffic flow, axons are often coated in this fatty substance called myelin.
Myelin, right, right. That rings a bell. It's like the insulation on electrical wires, isn't it? It helps the signal travel faster.
You nailed it. Myelin acts as an insulator, preventing the signal from degrading as it travels down the axon. This allows for much faster communication between neurons, which is, super important for things like quick reflexes and complex thought processes.
This is all starting to paint such a vivid picture. We've got this incredibly organized and efficient system for sending signals down the axon. But what about receiving information in the first place? That's where the dendrites come in, right?
You got it. If the axon is the highway sending information out, then dendrites are this intricate network of roads and side streets receiving information from other neurons. They're covered in thousands of tiny receptors, each one tuned to a specific type of signal. Imagine
Okay, so the dendrites are like a city's network of streets, with receptors acting as these docks for specific signals. What happens when a signal actually arrives at one of these docks?
well, that's when things get really interesting. The arrival of a signal can actually cause changes in the dendrite itself, particularly in those tiny protrusions called dendritic spines. You can think of dendritic spines as like antenna on our city's rooftops, constantly adjusting for better reception.
Hold on, so our brain cells are literally reshaping themselves as we learn.
They are. Pretty cool.
That's mind-blowing.
Okay.
So those changes in the dendritic spines, those are actually what allow us to learn and remember new information.
You're catching on quickly. Research suggests that changes in dendritic spines are definitely crucial for learning and memory. In fact, abnormalities in these spines have been linked to cognitive impairments.
Wow, really?
Yeah, which really highlights just how important they are. But here's the thing, neurons, they're not the only players in this intricate brain symphony.
Right. Glial cells. I was just about to bring those up.
Yes, the unsung heroes of the brain.
I'll admit, I used to think of glia as just the glue holding everything together in the brain.
It's a common misconception. It's true that glia, they don't fire electrical signals the way neurons do, but their role is anything but passive.
Oh, I believe that. So what are they doing in there?
Think of them like the stage crew, the orchestra conductor, and the audience all rolled into one.
Wow, that's quite the analogy.
They're essential. Take astrocytes, for example.
Astrocytes.
Yeah, they're like the ultimate multitaskers of the brain. Not only do they support and nourish neurons, but they also play this critical role in regulating the environment around the neurons, making sure everything is in tip-top shape for those neurons to communicate.
So they're like the cleanup crew, making sure those signals can get through.
Exactly. And they can even act as traffic directors, managing the flow of information between neurons.
So we've got signal senders, signal receivers, support staff, a cleanup crew. It's like a whole city, but on a microscopic scale. This deep dive has completely changed the way I think about the brain.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Oh.
And we've only just scratched the surface. The more we learn about neurons and glia, the more we realize just how complex and interconnected everything is.
It really is humbling. All of this, from protein synthesis to signal transmission to glial cell activity, it's happening inside our heads every second of every day.
It's mind-boggling.
And it's what allows us to think, to learn, to experience the world around us.
This incredible symphony of cellular activity, it's the very essence of what makes us human.
And that's all the time we have for today's deep dive into the world of neurons and glia. But it really makes you think, doesn't it? Something as amazing as consciousness arising from the activity of these tiny cells. And we can actually influence how well they function through learning, through new experiences, even through the choices we make each day.
It's powerful stuff.
It really is. Be sure to join us next time as we continue to explore the fascinating world of the brain right here on The Deep Dive.